So that being, we'll go ahead and begin. So again, hello and welcome everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar. My name is William Moore, and I'm with OJJDP's NTTAC, and that's the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention's National Training and Technical Assistance Center, also known as NTTAC. And I want to welcome you all to today's webinar, Homeless Youth Prevention, on Homeless Youth Prevention. Our participating organizations for today's webinar include participants from the Family and Youth Services Bureau, from SchoolHouse Connection, the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. As your technical host, I would like to take a couple of minutes to discuss a few features of Adobe Connect webinar platform and make a few announcements for you all to keep in mind. Please note that today's webinar is being recorded and will be published on NTTAC's YouTube channel. The webinar recording will be archived on NTTAC's YouTube channel, where you can also view past webinars. If you would like any supporting materials, please contact the OJJDP NTTAC Help Desk. For those wishing to download a copy of the PowerPoint slides and other important documents, you may do so by locating the handouts pod directly above the chat area. Here, you will also find an FAQ for webinar participants that will likely address any technical related questions. Click on the name, then click the download button. During today's webinar, presenters will address questions during our Q&A segment of the webinar. Please type your questions into the chat box as they arise. For those of you participating in today's webinar as a group, please take a minute to help us count. Go to the chat window and type in the total number of additional people in the room with you today. If you're viewing alone, there's no need to type anything this time. And I'll give folks just a couple of seconds to do that. Again, type in the total number of additional people that are in the room with you today. If you're viewing alone, there's no need to type anything at this time, only the total number of additional people viewing the webinar with you today. Following today's webinar, attendees will receive a certificate of attendance. This certificate is sent approximately 1 hour following the conclusion of the event and is sent via an Adobe Connect thank you email. Please keep an eye on your email for your certificate. Please note that only participants that are registered and signed in will receive a certificate of attendance. At the conclusion of today's webinar, you will be provided with a link to a brief survey about today's presentation. The feedback you provide is used to assist in future planning and training. I will now turn the webinar over to Elizabeth Wolf, who will provide a welcome and an introduction of today's presenters. Thank you.
Thank you, William. Good afternoon. My name is Elizabeth Wolf, and I am the Training and Outreach Coordinator for the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention. I'm pleased to welcome you to today's webinar entitled Homeless Youth Prevention. We are super lucky because we have a stellar panel of presenters. We've got Christopher Holloway, who's a Program Manager at the Family and Youth Services Bureau, U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. In this role, he also serves as the National Runaway Safe Line and the Domestic Victims of Human Trafficking Program. Prior to this, Mr. Holloway was a Federal Crime Victim Assistance Team Lead at the Office of Victims of Crime. And before that, he was a colleague of mine at the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, where he served as the Missing and Exploited Children's Program Coordinator. Patricia Julianelle is the Director of the Program Advancement and Legal Affairs for SchoolHouse Connection. She is an attorney and legal consultant for state and local governments and nonprofit organizations, and has over 20 years of experience defending children's and youth's rights, including advocating for youth in the education, juvenile justice, child welfare, and immigration systems. Norm Suchar is the director of the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development's Office of Special Needs Assistance Programs, which supports the nationwide commitment to ending homelessness. Mr. Suchar previously directed the Center for Capacity Building at the National Alliance to End Homelessness, which helped communities implement system-wide strategies that prevent and end homelessness. Thank you to those who are going to be on the panel, and with that, I will turn it over to our first speaker.
Thanks, Elizabeth, and it's great to be with you all. Great to hear you again, and I'm honored to be joined by Norm and Patricia and Francis in this presentation. As Elizabeth indicated, I am with the Department of Health and Human Services in the Administration for Children and Families, Family and Youth Services Bureau. And Family and Youth Services Bureau, or FYSB as we refer to it, has three very distinct programs that intersect on the issues of homelessness, adolescent pregnancy, and domestic violence. And so our mission is really to focus on the intersectionality of those three issues and work every day to put an end to youth homelessness, domestic violence, and adolescent pregnancy. So we're positioned, as I said, in the Administration for Children and Families under the Administration on Children, Youth, and Families. Many of you may be aware of our sister bureau, the Children's Bureau, that works with foster care and child welfare organizations across the country. And then within FYSB, we have our Family Prevention and Services Division that handles the domestic violence programs, and then the Division of Adolescent Development and Support, which houses both the Runaway and Homeless Youth Program and the Adolescent Pregnancy Prevention Program. So, what is the Runaway and Homeless Youth Program? For starters, we have, over the past several years, focused our efforts on outcomes that really impact youth's lives in four core areas, that being well-being, stable housing, education, employment, and permanent connections. We believe that if we can have a positive impact on a young person's trajectory in one or all four of these four core outcomes, that they will move towards self-sufficiency and a healthy and sustainable life going forward. We reflect more broadly on what youth homelessness means in the context of recent research conducted by Chapin Hall under the Voices of Youth Count. This is really a layperson's understanding of what it means to be homeless, particularly for youth. And it can mean anything from sleeping on the streets, what we would all envision as a traditional scenario for being homeless, to being in a shelter, being kicked out of home, running away, and one that is a little more ubiquitous is couch surfing or living with friends and relatives when you're moving night to night or on a very routine and regular basis where you don't have a stable place to live. For the Runaway and Homeless Youth Program's purposes, we define homelessness in one of two ways. One is that you are a youth under the age of 18 for the purposes of our emergency shelter program who cannot go home and does not otherwise have a safe or stable home to go to. And then for our transitional living program, which I'll talk about in a moment, it's a youth between the ages of 16 up to 22, also who cannot go home or does not otherwise have a safe or appropriate living situation to turn to. And then, of course, because we are the Runaway and Homeless Youth Program, we do provide services to youth who have run away, which is defined as those who have decided to leave without permission of an adult or a legal guardian. And so the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act is tightly connected to the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act. They were both passed in the same year, and the RHY Act is actually a separate title under the JJDP Act. Primarily, it was passed for the purposes of keeping young people, particularly those under the age of 18, out of child welfare and out of the juvenile justice system. It was meant to be a safety net so that young people didn't end up in juvenile justice if they were found to be committing a truant or otherwise non-offense that wouldn't be considered an offense if it was an adult. So I'm going to walk through our three programs briefly. They run in sequence in terms of our contact with young people and how we hope to provide them services. And to start, we have our street outreach program, which is really intended to be that connecting point for young people who are otherwise living on the streets or unsafe situations, who are at greatest risk for exploitation and human trafficking. This is the smallest of our programs in terms of dollar amount, but it's the largest in terms of contact that we have with young people on a yearly basis, averaging somewhere around 20,000 individual contacts per year, meaning these are street staff, street workers who are working in association with a program to meet young people on the street, engage them, and hope that they can convince them to either go home, if that's appropriate, or to a shelter where they'll be safe and not at greatest risk for trafficking or exploitation. Progressing from the street outreach program is our emergency shelter, which is the basic center program. This is the oldest of our three primary programs, and it really is the foundation for the RHY program going back to the 70s. We have nearly 300 temporary shelters throughout the country, and they provide up to 21 days worth of shelter, food, medical emergency care, counseling for youth under the age of 18, and again, not to exceed 21 days. The ideal is that the young people will go back to their families, but often that's not appropriate, and in those instances where where it's not appropriate for that young person to return home, we'll move into our transitional living program if there is availability in that program. But as you can see from the slide, we've provided emergency shelter services to more than 3,000 young people, at least in 2014, and our more recent statistics reveal similar numbers. Interestingly, the vast majority of the young people that come into the emergency shelter to the Basic Center program are coming from home or the home of a legal guardian or a relative. Fortunately, the majority of those do go back home or to a guardian, but there are a large percentage of young people where that's not an option. And if it's not an option, we try to make available our transitional living program. We also have a maternity group home component. The transitional living program is designed for older youth, those that are over 16 up to the age of 22, who realistically can't go home. They don't have a safe or stable place to turn, and they're lacking in some very important social skills, whether that's financing, they need to complete their education, they need job training, they need more acute medical or mental health services, and the Transitional Living Program, or TLP as we call it, is able to provide those services over a longer term period. It's up to 18 months, and in some cases it can be almost 2 years depending on when the young person entered the program. And the goal is for them to find themselves in a place of sustainability so that once they've left the program, they can move to lives on their own. There may be support functions that go hand in hand with that, but ultimately they've been given the skills and they've been given the stability that they're ready for self-sufficiency. Average age here is 19, and this is one of the areas where we have significant crossover with our partners in HUD because of now we're going into an adult-based system. A large percentage of the young people that we're seeing in our transitional living program are coming from unstably housed situations. In other words, they are couch surfing, they're moving from place to place, living with one relative to another relative. And this is an opportunity for them to find some stability and that trajectory towards self-sufficiency going forward. As I noted, we have a maternity group home component that is part of the transitional living program, and that is specifically designed for all youth, not just pregnant mothers, but parenting youth that could be male or female who have dependent children and who are struggling with finding a safe alternative for themselves and for their dependent children. And one of the primary components of the maternity group home initiative is that we not only provide the full scope of services that all the TLP programs provide, but we also offer prenatal care, early childhood care, classes in childhood development, as well as parenting classes, and then child care for those young people who need to go to school or who are working, would not otherwise have access to a child care provider. So that is our three primary programs. We're structured on street outreach, basic center, and transitional living program. For all of you who are listening to this webinar, there are other resources that are available to you that I would certainly encourage you to take advantage of. First is our runaway RHY Clearinghouse, the National Clearinghouse on Homeless Youth and Families. This is a resource that's available to any organization, whether you provide services directly as a grantee of the Runaway and Homeless Youth Program, or if you're a youth serving agency, a homeless provider, whatever capacity it is that you serve young people who are experiencing homelessness. There are countless resources, trainings, toolkits, guides available at no cost to you on the Clearinghouse website. Also available with more limited access is our Runaway and Homeless Youth Training and Technical Assistance Center. We are statutorily mandated under RHYTAC, as we call it, to provide TNTA resources to our grantees first and foremost. However, we do have a large body of resources that are available for free or at little charge to any organization who is providing services to young people who are experiencing homelessness. So I would certainly encourage you to visit both the Clearinghouse and RHYTAC's website to see what resources are available for you there at little or no cost. And then finally, a significant resource to the Runaway and Homeless Youth Program, as well as programs that provide services to human trafficking victims and in coordination with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, as well as the Domestic Abuse Hotline, is our Runaway Safe Line, National Runaway Safe Line. This resource goes back to the mid-1970s and has been around and funded by the Family and Youth Services Bureau since 1976. It is, in fact, a hotline, now obviously in digital form, so there's chat functionality, there's blog, text, obviously traditional phone calls are available, but it allows National Runaway Safe Line to do a number of things. First and foremost, it allows youth to connect to their families in a safe and we'll say in a safe way, and I apologize for stumbling on my words. Essentially, if a young person is on the street or they're in a place where they don't want their parents to know where they're at, they can connect to their family through the Safe Line, and the Safe Line will coordinate a phone call or some other mechanism to have a conversation with the family. The Safe Line also maintains a repository of programs throughout the country, shelters, both emergency shelters as well as longer-term shelters, drop-in centers that may be available to young people, so that if they're in a situation where they're feeling unsafe, they can call the Safe Line, and the Safe Line can direct them to a resource that's immediately near where they're located. Also, the Safe Line offers a tremendous resource through Greyhound, and this is home free, and it's basically a free service for eligible young people to have a bus ticket back home if they found themselves in a situation where they have no money, but they don't have any idea how to return home. All three offer tremendous opportunities for both grantees of ours, but as well as for organizations that are not grantees. And particularly for the National Runaway Safe Line, there is a free curriculum that talks about youth prevention. And it's both in Spanish and English, and you can go to the Runaway Safe Line website. You can download it. I would certainly encourage any organization who is dealing with homelessness prevention to take a look at this curriculum and see if it would work for you and your organization. And that is it for me. I look forward to answering some questions at the end. I've actually been able to wrap that up with a minute to spare. So Patricia, you are the beneficiary of an extra minute.
Thank you, Chris. I'll try to use it responsibly. I appreciate your presentation and the information you provided. I am Patricia Julianelle, as you all have heard already. Good morning and good afternoon to everyone on the call, depending on where you're from. I work in an organization called SchoolHouse Connection. We're a national nonprofit organization, so a little bit different perspective than that of some of the co-presenters who are working with the federal government on grant programs and other kinds of services. We do advocacy at the state and federal level. We provide assistance to school districts, institutions of higher education, and early childhood programs. And we also have a youth leadership and scholarship program, and we'll actually get to share with you a little bit of information from one of our scholars in a few slides. Before we get started, I'm going to ask for some help to launch a poll. I'd like to hear a little bit from those of you who are attending today regarding your experiences with youth experiencing homelessness. So I'm interested to know, for those of you who are on the call, have you worked with a youth who was homeless either before or after being in the custody of the juvenile justice system? I assume the answer is going to be yes for most of you, but I also expect many of you have not had that experience. And so that'll just help me orient my presentation a little bit and get a little bit of input from you all.
And for our audience members taking the poll, remember you can select the button next to your answer, the little circle or bubble there, and that will give you the opportunity to submit your answer to the question. Thank you.
Thanks, William. It looks like maybe most of the votes have come in. Maybe we could move back to the presentation. I think we have a good snapshot of participants. So it looks like roughly 3/4 of you answered yes to that question, that you have worked with youth who are experiencing homelessness either before or after entering the juvenile justice system. So that was helpful. Thank you for doing that. What I really want to talk about today in my presentation is access to education for youth who are experiencing homelessness. We have a definition of homeless in the Federal McKinney-Vento Act as it applies to public schools. The same definition also applies to institutions of higher education, early childhood programs, and a number of other programs. So when we're talking about education rights, this is the definition of homeless that we're looking at, and that's on your slide right now. We're looking at youth who are sharing the housing of others due to loss of housing, economic hardship, or a similar reason. Chris referred to this population a lot in his presentation when he referred to couch surfing youth. We note that a lot of the young people we work with, the people they're staying with may not actually be friends or relatives. They may be people that they just met at an event or in a shelter, or sometimes, unfortunately, they are actually traffickers themselves. So we see in public schools that about 3/4 of the students experiencing homelessness that public schools are working with are living in this particular living situation. The definition also includes children and youth who are living in motels, hotels, trailer parks, or campgrounds due to the lack of an adequate alternative. So again, this wouldn't cover all children or youth living in a trailer park, for example. It would depend, of course, on the adequacy of that trailer. It includes youth who are sleeping in cars, parks, abandoned buildings, bus or train stations outside, or in substandard housing as well. And then also youth, of course, who are living in emergency shelters or transitional living programs like the types that Chris was talking about. Students experiencing homelessness identified by public school districts, most of them are not living in shelters or housing programs due to the lack of those resources. So the demand for those is really outpacing the supply. So we see only 14% of the students that school districts are identifying who are staying in emergency or transitional shelters. And the most recent data that we have from the Federal Department of Education is from the 2016-17 school year, where public schools identified over 1.3 million children and youth experiencing homelessness. And those are just students who are actually in school and actually identified by schools as experiencing homelessness. We know that students experiencing homelessness are at greater risk of entering the school-to-prison pipeline and are at greater risk of entering juvenile justice systems and facilities. There's some data on your slide there from a few states for which we have data available. There's also a publication in your handouts pane that you can take a look at to get more information about this data, as well as strategies for how schools can exercise positive discipline and interrupt the school-to-prison pipeline, and particularly for youth who are experiencing the trauma and the instability of homelessness. So you can see across a variety of different states, we have roughly twice or 2.5 times more incidences of school discipline, like suspensions and expulsions, for students experiencing homelessness than for those who are housed. One of our scholars, I mentioned that we have a youth leadership and scholarship program. One of the scholars who we just met and awarded her scholarship just last month told a story about her own experience with being on probation as a result of poor school attendance. Students experiencing homelessness are much more likely to be chronically absent from school, and depending on the state and how it's defined, to be truant, and that unfortunately sometimes can lead, of course, to juvenile justice involvement. So one of our scholars talked about missing school and put on probation when what she really needed was some supports to be able to attend school. School's very important to her. In fact, she'll be graduating at the end of this month. So once she was able to provide, to receive some supports to attend, she was no longer struggling with truancy and probation. Chris talked a little bit about the Voices of Youth Count research from Chapin Hall and some of the really powerful data that came out of that study. That study found that the greatest risk factor for young adult homelessness is lacking a high school diploma or GED. Students without a high school degree were 3.5 times more likely to experience homelessness as young adults. So that can create a cycle. As I discussed, we have youth who are experiencing homelessness. They're more likely to be absent from school. They are more likely to enter the school-to-prison pipeline. They have a much higher risk of dropping out of school, which then increases their risk for young adult homelessness, which then can lead into homelessness as they grow older, and homelessness of their own children when they have children of their own. So at SchoolHouse Connection, we focus on education as a means of trying to interrupt this cycle. Actually, pregnancy was the second highest risk factor for young adult homelessness found by the Voices of Youth Count study. So I want to spend the rest of the time just giving a very basic high-level overview of some of the educational rights that youth experiencing homelessness have. If you're working with a student who is transitioning out of a juvenile justice facility into school, and you're trying to facilitate that youth's transition into school, it might be helpful to know some of the rights that are available to the youth if she or he is experiencing homelessness. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the McKinney-Vento Act. Probably the most important things I want you to know is that there are personnel in your state and in your local school district who are responsible for implementing this law in your state. So if you have questions, if you need support, there are people for you to go to for help. Every state has a state coordinator for McKinney-Vento. I'm happy to provide information for those people if you reach out to me directly. There is also a link for the National Center for Homeless Education that was on a slide just a few slides previously. And the National Center for Homeless Education has a database with the contact information for all the state coordinators. So you can contact your state coordinator for questions. Also, every local educational agency, which includes school districts as well as charter schools and county offices of education and regional units of education, every one of those bodies is required to have a local liaison for the education of students who are experiencing homelessness. So you have someone on the local level to contact as well. That person is in charge of identifying students experiencing homelessness, making sure they can enroll in school, making sure they can attend, and also providing them with referrals to other services that may be available in the community. So it might be a referral, for example, to a Runaway and Homeless Youth Act program like Chris was discussing. It might be a referral to health care, mental health care, or other needs that youth has. A couple of just the very basic rights provided under the McKinney-Vento Act. Again, just so you have these in your mind as you are advocating for youth in your own communities. To know that they have the right to remain in the school of origin. Essentially what that means is if a youth is moving around because of homelessness, they can stay in the same school. They don't have to change schools every time their living situation changes. They're able to stay in that school for the whole time they're experiencing homelessness, as long as that's in their best interest to remain in that school. And actually the school district has to provide them with transportation to get to that school. So that's a really important thing for youth to know as they're thinking about trying to stay in one school where they might be advancing towards their high school diploma, and they don't want to have to change schools every time they move. Another important right for all of you to be aware of is the right to immediate enrollment, so that students who are experiencing homelessness, even if they don't have the documents that are typically required, those immunization records, school records, proof of residency, particularly for unaccompanied youth, if they don't have a parent or legal guardian, the lack of those documents and the lack of that parent or legal guardian cannot delay their enrollment in school. They do have the right to enroll in school immediately, even without all of that information. So again, another just important right to keep in mind. There are many other pieces of the McKinney-Vento Act that we don't have time to go into today, but I just wanted to hit some of the highlights for you. You do have in the handout pane a 2-page summary of the Act that you can take a look at to get a little bit more detail. There are provisions to help youth accrue credits. So again, whether they're moving around because of homelessness, whether they've fallen behind due to a period of time involved in the juvenile justice system or a period of time when they weren't able to attend school, there are provisions to help them recover and accrue credits, a requirement that they be allowed to participate in extracurricular activities immediately. They're automatically going to be eligible for free school meals, so they don't have to worry about completing that application. They'll be able to get school meals, lunch or breakfast or whatever their school offers. They have a specific right to be able to access the school counselor. So even in addition to the rights that other students have to be able to access school counselors in a typical school environment, they actually have kind of a special right to be able to have special attention and special time with school counselors to help them graduate from school. Again, remembering that that high school diploma is going to be a big factor in determining whether or not they'll be experiencing homelessness again as young adults. And also assistance for that transition to higher education as well. That really completes the part that I wanted to provide about the rights of students experiencing homelessness under the McKinney-Vento Act. The only last resource I wanted to mention is another thing that's in your handouts pane. The Coalition for Juvenile Justice, the National Network for Youth, and the National League of Cities put together a document on principles regarding youth experiencing homelessness and juvenile justice involvement. It's a really great resource, very exhaustive. They get a lot of input from a number of organizations. So you might want to take a look at that document. Again, it's in your handouts pane. I think it's just called Principles, and then some other information after that. But if you click on the Principles document, you'll be able to take a look at that. So thank you for your time. I will be checking your questions in the audience Q&A panel. And with that, I'll pass it on to Norm.
Thank you very much, Patricia. Thank you, Chris. So I'm Norm Suchar with the Office of Special Needs Assistance Programs here at HUD, and our office operates several homeless assistance programs, including one dedicated specifically to youth. So I want to start by talking about sort of the organizing principle behind our work and sort of the overall set of strategies and values we work on. So the sort of basis and foundation for how we think about homelessness is the Federal Strategic Plan to Prevent and End Homelessness, which is called Home Together. So this is a plan that many federal agencies work together on. It was just re-released about a year ago, and you can sort of see some of the quotes from the plan there, but the plan really does sort of guide our efforts and our interagency work. So if you're interested in how federal agencies are working on homelessness and sort of what they're prioritizing, the federal plan is a great place to start. And one of the things the federal plan does is it sets out specific goals for ending homelessness, including to end homelessness among veterans, end chronic homelessness among people with disabilities, to end homelessness among families with children, to end homelessness among unaccompanied youth, and to end homelessness among all other individuals. So one of the things we've learned over time is that because resources both within federal agencies and at the local level are often population specific, it is helpful to think about the different populations of people experiencing homelessness and tailor solutions to each population. And so the federal strategic plan sets out goals and strategies for each of the populations. So I want to talk about the continuum of care and what a continuum of care does. So for HUD's homeless assistance programs, We are organized a little differently than traditional federal programs. We fund about 7,000 different projects around the country, a little over $2 billion in assistance. And that's a lot of projects, it's a lot to manage. And so one of the sort of organizing principles we have is the continuum of care process. And a continuum of care is simply a set of stakeholders that represent a particular geographic area. And that geographic area might be as small as a county, it might be as large as an entire state. For example, the state of Montana is one continuum of care, the state of Connecticut has 2 continuums of care, and several states have, 10 to 20 continuums of care. I think California has a little over 40 continuums of care. So the geography can vary a lot, but the principle here is that the continuum of care is the group of stakeholders that are organized to accomplish several things. One is that they try to plan homeless assistance to make sure it all works together well, to make sure that specific needs are met, and to address the needs of different populations and subpopulations of people experiencing homelessness. It's also responsible for coordinating assistance for people, and one of the processes they use is called coordinated entry. Coordinated entry is a process by which a continuum of care sets up a system for people to access homeless assistance. So rather than calling around to individual programs, they either access one location, or perhaps there's a hotline number, or some combination of things. Every continuum of care gets to decide how to organize this, but there's one way to access assistance. You get prioritized based on your needs. You have access to all the different resources within that continuum of care. The continuum of care also collects and reports data, including through what we call HMIS, or Homeless Management Information Systems. And continuums of care are also responsible for applying for funding. So we expect to have sort of one consolidated application for each continuum of care that includes a bunch of projects. So if you're looking to start up homeless assistance programs, you don't directly apply to HUD. You work with your continuum of care, and they submit an application with a bunch of projects to us. So we fund a lot of different interventions through our homeless assistance programs. Chris talked about some of these already, and in some ways the interventions we fund are very similar to the interventions FYSB funds. There are some important differences. I think he talked well about outreach and its importance. We fund a fair amount of emergency shelter. We actually have a separate program called the Emergency Solutions Grant, which funds emergency shelter. The Emergency Solutions Grant is a formula program. It goes to city, county, and state governments. And so if you wanted to apply for that kind of funding, you would go to your, generally your local Department of Housing and Community Development or your local Department of Human Services, and they receive that emergency solutions funding, and you can apply to them for assistance. We also fund something called rapid rehousing. Rapid rehousing is short or medium-term assistance, so it lasts up to 24 months. It provides financial assistance, including rental assistance, for up to 24 months. It also provides case management, other supportive services, and it provides housing location assistance to help you identify housing, work with landlords, negotiate with landlords, etc. And that's intended to meet both housing needs and other needs that people may have, including employment, education, it may be domestic violence needs, or whatever other service needs someone has. Rapid rehousing programs can either provide or more generally will connect people with resources in the community that can provide those services. There's something called permanent supportive housing. So permanent supportive housing is similar to rapid rehousing in that it provides both financial assistance for housing, including rental assistance, and fairly intensive supportive services. The difference is that permanent supportive housing is long-term. It is available for as long as the person needs it. It tends to serve people with very severe disabilities, including mental health disorders, including substance use disorders, chronic physical health conditions, and other disabilities. And then we also fund transitional housing, and transitional housing comes in many different flavors. You heard Chris talk about TLP programs, for example. We also have programs that provide recovery services, transitional housing programs that focus on domestic violence and other kinds of programs. But transitional housing programs tend to be facility-based. People can stay there for up to 24 months. They typically stay there for between 3 and 9 months, depending on the program, but they can stay up for up to 24, and then they move out. I want to talk a little bit about rapid rehousing because that's something that's a little unique to our programs. I have a screenshot here of a few program profiles we did about rapid rehousing programs that serve youth. Again, rapid rehousing is shorter-term assistance. It has not been a very long time that people have been doing rapid rehousing for youth. They really sort of came to prominence, I don't know, no more than 5 or 10 years ago, but we are starting to see a lot of rapid rehousing programs serving young people, and they've been quite successful. Young people, it gives young people a lot of independence, something a lot of them are seeking. And you can see we have 4 profiles up, and there's a link to those, but you can also just do a web search for rapid rehousing for youth, and they should come up pretty easily. I want to talk a fair amount about a youth homelessness demonstration program that we also fund. So this is something we have funded 2 rounds of this program. We actually have a notice of funding availability out right now for a 3rd round. It closes May 15th, which is pretty soon. So if you're not connected to this, then it's probably a little late for this round. However, there will be a 4th round that will come out in several months. So the youth homelessness demonstration is kind of an interesting program. So it's a demonstration program. So continuums of care work with stakeholders in the community, including child welfare agencies, including schools, including youth serving providers, and other stakeholders who work on youth homelessness. And JJ programs are definitely partners who should be involved in their youth demonstration programs. But they come together and they sort of do a lot of planning to find innovative approaches to reducing youth homelessness. In this context, when we talk about youth, we talk about youth up to age 24, and that can include both youth under 18 and adult youth, again up to age 24. Generally serves unaccompanied youth, so youth that don't have children with them, but a lot of the programs also serve youth parents, young parents and their families. So the youth demonstration, very focused on innovation. We funded 10 sites 2 years ago. Last year we funded an additional 11 sites. This year we'll fund about 20 to 25 sites, and again, there will be another round of funding. If your community has not applied for youth demonstration funding, I'd strongly encourage you to do so. The planning process is very helpful for youth homelessness efforts, but also, the sites that receive funding get quite a bit of funding. For the 10 sites we funded in the first round, it was $33 million, so that's a little over $3 million per site on average. So there's a pretty important component about innovation, and there's a pretty important component about really making youth and youth voice the center of the process. So we require that any applicant have a youth action board, and so that's a board made up of currently or formerly homeless young people who actually have to have some decision-making authority in the process. So they have to be involved in planning the application, planning and execution of projects, and evaluation of projects. And from what we've seen so far in the demonstration sites, that youth voice and youth input has been incredibly valuable. to the process. So, we're very encouraged by that, and we'll continue to make that a central part of youth homelessness work going forward. As part of that, we published a series of guidebooks, and there are 3 topics there: system planning, mainstream system collaboration, and promising program models. And so with that, I am going to turn things back over to William. William?
Great. Yes, and thank you very much for that. So now, and thank you to all of our presenters for a very wonderful presentation today. So now we're moving over into our question and answer segment. And with that being said, I'd like to introduce everyone to our question and answer moderator, Francis Mendez. Francis has over 20 years of experience managing services, programs, and projects on vulnerable youth. Francis is also currently the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention's National Training and Technical Assistance Center. So I would like to take now the time to turn it over to Francis Mendez to help to moderate our questions today. Thank you, Francis.
Thank you, William. So thank you, everyone, for attending. And thank you to those who submitted questions in advance. Between the current questions we've gotten and the pre-submitted questions, we have over 100 questions. So whatever questions we don't get to, we will provide after the webinar FAQ. So I'm going to alternate between the presenter orders and questions and alternate between ones pre-submitted and posted online. You can continue to post questions on chat. We're recording them, and we'll get to them if we can. So the first question is for Chris. So the question is, could you explain the connection between foster care and homelessness? We can't hear your audio, Chris. If you could unmute.
Sorry about that. I have myself on mute. That's a complicated question, and I'll do my best to try to provide a response. What I will also do is provide an electronic copy of a document that was jointly drafted between the Family and Youth Services Bureau and the Children's Bureau in 2014. And here in HHS, we call them information memorandums. And specifically, this document spoke to the eligibility of youth in foster care, child welfare, and juvenile justice to be admitted to a basic center program, to one of our emergency shelters. And it speaks to the need for local systems, particularly JJ, child welfare and foster care, to work closely with the basic center programs to have appropriate contract beds available when the eligibility of that young person is in question. So I'll make sure I provide that to JJ and NTTAC for dissemination. But to the question, I think the connection is what we expect the connection to be. We have, at least from data going back to 2013, hundreds of thousands, nearly 400,000 kids who are in the foster care system, and the foster care analysis and reporting system that the Children's Bureau uses, called AFGARS, reported then that nearly 4,500 youth ran away from their foster care placement. And that's for young people under the age of 18. So immediately we acknowledge that there's a large percentage of young people who are in foster care who are running away, and oftentimes that's as a result of connections with their biological parents. It's dealing with substance abuse issues, co-occurring issues that include health issues. But then over the age of 18, what we find is that even though the foster care system requires transitional plans for aging out of foster care, oftentimes those plans are not established well enough that there's a seamless transition from the foster care system to essentially being an independent adult. And we have a large percentage of young people who leave foster care who are finding themselves in otherwise homelessness situations. So that's a real brief approach to answering that question, but as I said, I'll make sure that I share this document so you can all see some more in-depth understanding of how the Children's Bureau and FYSB sees the connectivity between these two populations, that is, foster care and runaway and homeless youth.
Thank you, Chris. The next question is for Patricia. So how do schools document students as homeless that are couch surfing?
Well, schools identify students experiencing homelessness in a lot of different ways. As you might imagine, it can be very challenging because most students and families don't want people to know about their homelessness, so they're not generally marching into the school building saying, I'm homeless and I want my McKinney-Vento rights. So schools have to do a lot of outreach. They do some basic things like put information on the website, put posters up in the school, put posters around the community and in campgrounds, in health clinics, in laundromats and convenience stores, things like that. They're also, upon enrollment in school, asking some questions about the family's housing situation. So many schools now have just standard questions on their enrollment forms that they don't ask the question, are you homeless? Because again, not a lot of people are going to understand or to certainly check a box on that, but they might ask questions like, are you staying temporarily with other people? And then if that box is checked on the enrollment form, that would be referred to the liaison to do some additional conversations with the family, get a little bit more information to make the determination about whether this is actually a situation that meets the definition of homelessness or not. So there's definitely some conversation and some information gathering that needs to happen to make sure that the correct determination is being made by the school. So it's really a team effort. It's going to be school counselors, school principals, enrollment staff, teachers, community members, working together with your local runaway and homeless youth programs, working together with organizations in the community that might work with LGBT youth, Boys and Girls Clubs, other community agencies that might be coming into contact with young people and getting information about their living situation, and then able to either share that appropriately with the school or encourage the youth to speak with someone at the school so that they can get the support they need. So it's really a team effort, and it's not a simple process, and it's certainly something that we all know that schools are not identifying all the students experiencing homelessness, but hopefully they're doing their best to get that information.
Great. Thank you, Patricia. The next question is for Norm. Are there transitional living programs that help young people get into an apartment on their own?
Yeah, so that's kind of the goal of the Rapid Rehousing Program is, and I probably wasn't clear enough when I was describing it, but the way Rapid Rehousing works is it helps young people find their own housing. Often it's an apartment that they rent on their own, or maybe an apartment that they share with friends or roommates. And it provides some financial assistance for them for a period of time while it helps them work on, improving their income and other things so they can afford the housing once the assistance ends and live independently. So Rapid Rehousing is very focused on helping people move to independence. And when we look at, just to add a little context here, when we look at the youth homelessness demonstration programs, that is the primary thing that the Youth Action Board and the communities are funding with that demonstration is Rapid Rehousing.
Great. Thank you, Norm. Next question is for Chris. So one of the questions was about how a commitment order from a DJJ can be a barrier for accessing transitional living program services. So are there grants that support state efforts to develop transition programs specifically for a DJJ youth, juvenile justice involved youth?
So that's a really great question, and I think there's a two-part response here. One is dealing specifically with eligibility for runaway and homeless youth programs. Our programs are completely voluntary, and we do not accept young people, either those into our emergency shelter program or into the transitional living program. So neither BCP nor TLP will accept youth who are being committed there through a system, whether that system is through juvenile justice, child welfare, or through foster care. When we're talking about older youth, there are dollars through the Children's Bureau under the Chafee program that help carry young people who have aged out of foster care at the traditional age of 18 and carry them on through, into some cases, up to the age of 24. But that's all Title IV money that is administered by the Children's Bureau, and there does have to be a connectivity with child welfare and the foster care system. Otherwise, I think what you're asking about, and I apologize if I'm not able to answer the question more directly, is really about reentry. Reentry from the juvenile justice system, where the court has some overarching legal obligation to ensure that the young person is housed, that they are receiving services, that they're being provided the necessary access to education and job training if that's appropriate. And in that scenario, if there is no safe and stable environment, we're now into a gray area of where a transitional living program takes priority in terms of providing services to that young person. If the juvenile justice system has released this individual and there is no other jurisdiction that has authority over them for the purposes of housing, if they fall under one of our two definitions, that being either homeless, meaning they have no safe alternative housing option available, or if they've otherwise run away from their placement at the age of 16, 17, then they potentially could be eligible, but there are some legal ramifications depending on what their status is as a juvenile offender. So it would be difficult to dissect the question and be able to make a blanket statement that applies across the juvenile justice spectrum, but those are just my initial thoughts on that question.
Great. Thank you, Chris. Next question is for Patricia. So I know, Patricia, you spoke about not having a high school diploma as a risk factor for homelessness. Can you talk about other key factors that cause youth homelessness?
Sure, and what I can do is put the link in the chat box for some of the Voices of Youth Count study documents. As I mentioned, they found the top risk factor for young adult homelessness to be lack of a high school diploma or GED. The second risk factor, according to their study, was being a single parent, young single parent, obviously. The third risk factor had to do with income. It was being low income. So those were the top three factors that they found in their study. And I'll go ahead and type that link into the chat box so that people can take a look at the documentation. There are a number of really excellent documents that came out of that study. I noticed another person was asking a question about rural homelessness. And again, the same Voices of Youth Count study found that the prevalence of youth homelessness is statistically identical in rural and urban communities. So it absolutely is a phenomenon that we see in every community in the country. So I'll go ahead and type that link in right now.
Great, thank you. Next question is for Norm. So we had several questions on the rapid rehousing program. How do you measure success? How do you access the funds? What happens if a young person has not located housing after the 24 months? Can you provide more detail, Norm, on the rapid rehousing program?
Sure. So the way you access rapid rehousing funds is the same way you get funding for any of our programs. Is you can either work with your local government and access rapid rehousing funding through the ESG, Emergency Solutions Grants program that I mentioned before, or you can work with your local continuum of care and apply for funding through the continuum of care competition. Those are both ways you can access funding. There are other funding sources as well, but those are the two primary ones. Obviously there's the youth homelessness demonstration. So just going through any of those application processes will let you apply for funding. So the main things we track in rapid rehousing programs are: do the programs end young people's homelessness? Do they return to homelessness? How long are they homeless? And do their incomes, both employment and benefit incomes, do those increase over the course of time? So we track all those things. At the local level, most communities track other factors as well. So they may be looking at, I know a lot of communities use the 4 domains that Chris talked about, and so again, at the local level, a lot of people are tracking a lot of other information as well, which we definitely support. And as far as the stability, again, the 24 months of assistance is, they can have 24 months of rental assistance once they move into their own apartment. We expect that people are going to, that young people will move into housing quickly, so it shouldn't take, 6-9 months to move in. And once they move in, they can have rental assistance for up to 24 months. Typically, what I've seen with youth rapid rehousing programs is the assistance averages about 10 or 12 months, but it varies a lot depending on the housing market in the community, depending on the specific needs of the young person involved, depending on other resources and support networks they have available. So it can vary pretty dramatically, but those are some of the sort of common ways those programs are structured.
Thank you, Norm. Next question is for Chris. I know you mentioned that your programs are voluntary. How do you get a youth into services if the parent is not willing to consent?
Well, it's a great question, and consent is an interesting aspect of our program because if a young person has left home without the consent of their parent, if they've absconded, if they've run away from a juvenile detention center, if they've run away from a child welfare placement, whether it's foster care, there is no consent. They've left without the permission of that legal guardian, and they are eligible for placement into the emergency shelter, the basic center program, for up to 21 days. Now, it's an obligation of the shelter staff, once they've determined that that young person is in fact connected to a system, to contact that system as quickly as possible to let them know that that young person is there and safe. And in the instance of a young person running away from home, our programs are required to attempt to contact a family member or legal guardian within 72 hours of that young person's arrival at the emergency shelter. Now, there are certainly exigent circumstances. If that young person is alleging some type of abuse or neglect, and there is no other legal guardian or adult that they feel safe connecting with, then the shelter has an obligation to follow up with Child Protective Services to let them know that an allegation has been made. In the instances of otherwise being homelessness, there are numerous instances where we have family homelessness, where the parents and younger children are eligible for other shelter services, but the adolescent or teenage youth is not able to go into the same shelter, into the family shelter. And so ours is an alternative to that, to living on the street or otherwise not having a safe place to live. And so the eligibility component can be a bit tricky, but what we focus heavily on in our communication with our RHY programs is applying the litmus test of one of two eligibility standards, that being they have run away from home or their legal placement, and or they are otherwise homeless and don't have a safe or stable place to return to. And working with the youth, trying to determine what the youth situation is, obviously making sure that they're safe and stable immediately, and then doing the necessary legwork to determine what the best appropriate option is going forward is what we ask our emergency shelters, our basic center programs to do.
Great, thank you, Chris. The next question is for Patricia. This is about providing immunization documentation for schools. If a student is homeless, how long do they get to provide that information?
So the McKinney-Vento Act does not have a time limit placed on that. It is the responsibility of the liaison to assist the student in getting immunization records or getting their immunizations if they need them. The vast majority of students were immunized when they were very young, and so they do have those immunizations, but there may be some who, for various reasons, didn't have them. So there's no time limit. It would really be looking at trying to get them connected to health services so that they could get the immunization and the records they need, but they would be attending school in the meantime. Because the other students in the school are immunized, there really isn't a public health issue. We actually had the Surgeon General a couple of administrations ago who did some research looking into that and determined that there was no public health risk in allowing our students experiencing homelessness to have that extra time to get their immunizations.
Great, thank you. The next question is for Norm. So we had questions about what's the timeline for the current round of youth demonstration program funding, and when do you expect the next round to come out?
Yeah, so the current round, the application closes May 15th, and we'll make a word sometime this summer. And then there's a fairly extensive planning process that goes on before they start implementing projects. So it's generally close to a year later that that projects will actually be up and running. And then for round 4, so the next round after this one, I don't have a specific timeline, but I expect that we will publish a notice of funding availability maybe in late this calendar year, like December, probably early next calendar year. So that's the timeline I expect.
Great, thank you, Norm. Next question is for Chris. How does FYSB involve youth and young adults in the development of program and policies?
It's a great question, Francis. And one of the underlying principles of our program is something called positive youth development, or PYD as we refer to it in short. And it's really about empowering young people to be engaged in the decision-making for their own trajectory. So it's not just about having a discussion about where you feel is the next appropriate placement to go and what's your feedback and thought on what you need in terms of services provided to you, but it's also within the milieu of our shelters. It's being active participants in making decisions about meal planning and what the organization does in terms of being responsive to the needs of youth both in and outside of the program. We have many programs that go so far as to include street youth who may not otherwise be willing yet to come into an emergency shelter, but they are happy to come into a drop-in center. And their voice is part of what the drop-in center offers. We need hot showers. We need food. We want to be able to have cooking classes. We want to be able to move at our own pace that is comfortable for us, that's low barrier enough for us to feel like we're willing to come forward and leave the street or leave that unstable condition. And in the process of providing this positive youth approach, we've empowered the young people to really be the masters of their own destiny. And it's not just leaving it in the hands of a caseworker or an outreach staff or a shelter staff, but it's really putting the power and the energy back into the youth's hands to make the decision of how they want to proceed forward and what's in their best interest.
Great, thank you. Next question is for Patricia. How can civil attorneys assist homeless youth with accessing their educational rights?
Sure. I mean, there's really a long list of needs that youth experiencing homelessness have that civil attorneys could help with, everything from helping with public benefits, identity theft. We see a lot of youth that we work with who have had their identity stolen by parents or guardians, who have their public benefits going to people that they're not staying with and who aren't caring for them any longer. So payee changes, helping them to get SNAP and other benefits that they're entitled to, although oftentimes people don't know and think they need a parent or a guardian to sign, but they don't. Family law issues, obviously juvenile justice issues come up, immigration issues. When it comes to education, if there are attorneys out there who want to help youth to be able to vindicate their education rights, whether that's in high school or college, attorneys are more than welcome to contact me, and I can provide them with the legal information they need and the support they need to advocate for those students. We're often looking for attorneys out in communities to advocate for students on educational issues and on a variety of issues. The ABA also has a program called the Homeless Youth Legal Network that is trying to create a community across the country of attorneys who want to support youth experiencing homelessness on a variety of legal needs. So again, if attorneys want to get involved in that, I'd be happy to provide information. I can type a link into the chat box as well so that people can get information about the Homeless Youth Legal Network and how they can be a part of that. That's a great new, or fairly new initiative by the Commission of Homelessness and Poverty at the ABA.
Great. Thank you, Patricia. The next question is for Norm. Can you talk about specifically for programs that target homelessness in rural areas and in Indian country?
Well, those are there are two different answers to that. So in rural areas, our programs often operate the same way they do in urban areas or suburban areas. Sometimes, you know, it obviously, the programs are often spread out more. Sometimes they don't quite have as much capacity and resources as they do in urban areas. But it's the same types of programs that are available for people. In tribal areas, it's a little more complicated. Because of the way our programs are structured, we're not allowed to provide grants to tribal entities, either tribally designated housing entities or other tribal organizations. And so that gets a little more complicated. Sometimes we can provide assistance to people who want to live in tribal areas through rapid rehousing and permanent supportive housing programs, but it's always a little tricky there. So the legal environment for that is just a little tougher than it is for non-tribal areas.
Great, thank you, Norm. The next question is...
Sorry,
sure.
I'd just like to add one more thing. One of the things in our youth homelessness demonstration program, I should have mentioned earlier, is we're trying to get more youth homelessness demonstration sites in rural areas. And so if people are interested, the odds of getting a grant if you work in a rural area are much, much better than if you're in a non-rural area. So if you're finding you're in a rural area that doesn't have a lot of youth resources, the youth homelessness demonstration is a great opportunity. And again, like, there's a much better likelihood of getting funded than in our other funding sources.
Great, thank you. Next question is for Chris. Can you talk more about the timeline for grants available from FYSB that people can apply for?
Sure. So the timeline, it's a fortuitous question considering that we're hopefully going to be releasing our funding opportunity announcements here in the coming week. Typically, our FOAs, as we call them, NOFAs as other solicitations, or whatever you want to refer to it as, ours are available for roughly 60 days, and then we make our awards toward the end of the fiscal year, which is September 29th, 2019. So we do have 4 funding opportunity announcements that we anticipate publishing over the next, hopefully, a couple of weeks, if not sooner. One is for our Basic Center program. That is an allocation-based funding, meaning we have to do a formula based on the population of youth under the age of 18 in each state, and then we set aside an allocation for each state dependent on that formula and the available appropriation. In the funding announcement, there is a link that gives you information about what each state's allocation is, so that you have some indication if there is money available or not money available from year to year. Also coming out is our street outreach program and transitional living program funding announcements. For the SOP, as it's referred, we're looking to fund about 100 programs in fiscal year 19. The maximum award amount is $150,000. And for the transitional living program, we have roughly $4.5 million available, not to exceed $250,000 per year for 3 years. And we'll end up being able to fund about 18 new transitional living programs. This year, we've also put out a separate announcement for maternity group homes. So our statute provides authority for us to fund maternity group homes as a subset of the TLP program. but the administration has made a decision this year to carve out a separate initiative where we will be providing funding to up to 18 programs specifically for the purposes of maternity group home programs. So those all should be out again, like I said, hopefully in the next week, no more than weeks, and then you'll have roughly 60 days to respond and submit your application for consideration.
Great, thank you, Chris. The next question is for Patricia. So this question is about when a young person turns 18, what options are available to them if they're a homeless student, if the youth system will stop working with them?
If the question is about the school system, the student would be eligible for public education until they graduate from high school and or until whatever age limit the state has set for public schooling. If the student has a disability, that would go up to age 22. But the school system would have to continue to serve that student until they can graduate from high school, or again until they reach whatever that maximum age limit is in the state. Looking at, of course, the specific needs of the youth, the credits they have, where they are in school, might determine different education programs that would be most appropriate for them. Rather than a traditional high school, it might be looking at some kind of an online program or an adult education program or a partnership with a community college. So the specific services would certainly need to respond to the needs of the student. But just simply turning 18 doesn't make a student ineligible for public education.
Great. So we've come to the end of our question and answer section. Thank you to the presenters for answering questions. Thank you to the audience for submitting your questions. So I'm going to turn it over to Elizabeth Wolf, who will make our closing comments.
Thank you, Francis. This is Elizabeth again. I want to thank all the panelists for taking the time today to share this information. I thought it was a really, really wonderful webinar, and we have lots of questions, obviously, which demonstrates that just how much information you provided and how many interested people there are. So thank you again. And with that, I would like to say thank you for participating, and I hope you have a lovely day. Don't forget to do the evaluation, and I will turn it back over to NTTAC.
All right, great. Thank you very much, again, Elizabeth, for providing those closing comments, and thank you to our presenters for providing very, very wonderful content. And most importantly, thank you all to our participants for joining us today for a very wonderful, lively discussion and great webinar. Just a few things that I want to wrap up with before we conclude. One of which I want to let you all know that you can contact NTTAC through the website displayed on this slide. You can stay up to date on the latest events information that we have by signing up for our listserv that we have. And also don't forget to check us out on Facebook, OJJDP NTTA. You can also contact the OJJDP through the Help Desk by following the contact information on this slide. And do you have a training or technical assistance need? Please submit a request via OJJDP's TTA 360 platform through the link displayed on this slide. As a reminder, the webinar recording will be archived on NTTAC's YouTube channel, where you can also view past webinars. For the event transcript and supporting materials, please contact the OJJDP TTA Help Desk. Please take a moment to view this disclaimer. And lastly, we would appreciate if you could take about 5 minutes to complete the feedback evaluation. Thank you all again for joining us today. Have a great afternoon.